Back in the day, Sunday best referred to a set of clothes that you had set aside in the closet that you would break out on Sunday morning. Usually nice dress clothes, dress shoes, maybe a hat. And the idea behind it was that we would don that uniform to hopefully mirror our inner image, that we want to be respectable and we want to be acceptable to the Lord, as if wearing a wedding garment to the Lord's feast. However, I would suggest that as Christians, we sometimes have to change out our dress shoes for hip boots. Jesus was born in a manger amid hay and manure. He died naked on the cross between two criminals. So to follow Christ means that we too are going to get messy. And so sometimes we need to wear the hip boots to be able to get on with the business of being a Christian, knowing that it's not perfect. And the imperfection doesn't necessarily settle in the way of God's mind as much as it does ours, where it's resistance to imperfection, considering somehow toxic. And not all messiness is that way. To be messy simply might mean that things seem disorganized to us. They don't make sense to us. It's a mystery to us. And we often like clarity. We like clear definitions. We like all of our things in rows, our ducks in a row. Today's set of readings, I believe, leads to quite a bit of messiness in basically two categories. There's one is who gets to speak for God and how do you do it? And the other is the question about what is marriage really all about? We hear that it is the Pharisees that approach Jesus with an idea to entrap him, asking him a question about the legitimacy of divorce. Jesus could have answered it as a yes or no answer. Yes, it's legal. No, it's not legal. But Jesus typically doesn't, and the Pharisees were kind of counting on Jesus not giving them a black and white answer because Jesus often saw the spirit of the law over the letter of the law. They anticipated that this Mosaic law, allowing husbands to write a bill of divorce for their wives, was going to be a problem for Christ, as it probably was for a lot of people. It really was a law of convenience for some and really not justice for all. And so they anticipated Jesus would have a problem with it, and therefore it begged the question, is Jesus nullifying just this one particular law or having issues? Or is he broadly saying that most Mosaic law doesn't really apply? So I think deep down, the Pharisees are asking the question, who gets to speak for God? And how do you know it's authentic? They started off believing that God gave Moses the 10 Commandments carved in stone. This was God's direct dictation to Moses, not to be messed with. The fact that it's written in stone shows its certainty. But then we also know that in Jewish tradition, Mosaic laws were expanded out to 613, fleshing out some of the unknown details. And then there's even more going on beyond that. So they find in this one particular law, does Moses have God's backing to say that this bill of divorce is permissible? And so Jesus launches into this discussion, this monologue, about if God's involved, if this marriage is sacramental, and it is God that is joining the husband and the wife, really mankind should not be getting into this mess. Should not be trying to declare it one way or the other. And so Jesus is pointing to the permanence of marriage, the sanctity of the bond of marriage. But again, we have to be a bit careful in how far we try to run with that in per se. So Jesus is saying mankind should not be too much involved in about saying where God is or where God isn't about things. And we tend to do that as a church. We need rules, we need regulations, but sometimes we go a little bit overboard for defining where God is or God isn't. So Jesus is making a case for the sanctity of marriage, that it can't be simply dismissed if God's involved, But we know in reality, not all marriages are going to be sacramental. Not all marriages work out. And the Catholic Church, deals with this by the process of declaration of nullity. And for the outsiders who do not know the distinction, they'd say, well, we're violating what Jesus said by getting into the rule games and saying that this divorce is valid, or you can dissolve a marriage. What the church is doing, or attempting to do, is to look at the background information and say, can we find evidence of a defect in the relationship that was significant enough to say that sacramental marriage wasn't possible? You didn't know it at the day that you said, I do, I do. Everybody was in good faith. But if there was a defect that was known only to God, God would not have entered into that marriage, making it a sacrament. So they're basically saying we were declaring the marriage null from the very beginning. People might have had children, might have done a lot of different things in good faith. God was still in the relationship, but it wasn't necessarily a sacrament. For the people on the outside, many people on the inside, they say, this sounds more like semantics than anything else. And the question comes up is, how do we know what is sacramental and what isn't? When people get married, we give them the benefit of the doubt because we can't put in a dipstick and pull it out on the wedding day and say, yep, God was there. He made it a sacrament. So we do an awful lot on giving the benefit of the doubt, and really, we need to accept that doubt does exist in our world, and particularly around things such as deeply important to us like marriage relationships. And so we hear Jesus talking about the intimacy of the physical intimacy being a key part of marriage, and yes, it is, but it's not totally defining of a marriage relationship. And so I think back on my parents, and they were non-demonstrative for their affections. At best, their sense of romance was a rare but awkward kiss on the lips. And so I grew up kind of wondering if myself and my siblings were not miraculous conceptions, because it was hard for me to wrap my head around how we came into being with the evidence of the relationship that was there. And so when I hear that Jesus is saying it was from the very beginning that this is the very core value of the marriage, I'm thinking, was their marriage in the context of what Jesus is talking about? I also later on realized that they got into a point in their lives where the family was not a happy place. And I'm thinking, how did they get together, and why are they still together? And I kind of thought that after the kids were out of the house, that they would go their separate ways. By the grace of God, they had been married 56 years when my dad passed away. So clearly, I didn't have an understanding of what marriage was in the context of their relationship. But we as a culture often impose our expectations and our hopes and our dreams for what marriage could be onto the living human relationship, and it's far more complex than that. Many will point to this scripture and say, this is God making man male and female, binary in its very exact form, and that's the only way that the human relationship can work in intimacy of marriage. And the reality is we know that our identity as sexual beings goes far beyond our physical attributes. And science is exploring the complexity to say it's even more complex than we can possibly imagine. So as much as I couldn't pigeonhole my parents' marriage, we as a culture and as a church need to be careful about pigeonholing everyone else as well. Do we have the capacity to say what is bound on earth and what is loosed on earth as well as heaven? Jesus gives Peter supposedly that power. But here's my perspective on how that works. My mother had the ability to speak for my dad. She would get him in all sorts of stuff. He was gifted with mechanics, and if she had a friend that needed something repaired, she'd say, I'll send Jim on over. And because they were married and because he loved her, he would do all sorts of things that weren't necessarily within his first-hand desire. But the reality was she was speaking for him in terms that might not really have been his true identity or his true form, but it was out of love that he allowed that to happen. But again, there were limitations. She had to know him well enough to know where to send him and ask him to do what that he was capable and willing to actually do. And so when we as a church are going to be speaking out and saying where God is or where God isn't, we really need to do so from a stance of prayer to know the heart of God, to say where God might actually work and where God might not actually work, as well as allow the mystery of God to do things that are beyond our control or our expectation. There were times when my dad would be working on something and he would go above and beyond the call of duty. He was doing an excellent artistic job for somebody else, and my mother would say, I didn't ask you to do that. Just get the job done. You have stuff at home you're supposed to be doing. And in reality, I think we as a church sometimes think the same way, like God may actually be doing something sacramental off the books, off the charts, and we get our knickers in a twist, and that was God's call, not ours. So how do we deal with this complexity? One is get used to the mess. It's not clear. The role of marriage has been evolving from a long time, and it's still ongoing. Remember, years ago, marriages were arranged. They were very functional. It wasn't freedom between the two spouses. That still exists in some parts of our world today. So we don't have a handle completely on what's going on, and thank God, because it's part of the mystery of the beauty of God's creation. I think Jesus gives us an answer in the latter part of this gospel by basically saying it is those that are the most childlike that are able to enter into the kingdom of God. And children, by their very nature, tend to be less judgmental, less prejudiced in their mindset. Before you fix in your child a fear of things that are messy, they're willing to play in the mud, turn over rocks, poke at bugs. It's only what they learn from adults later on that makes them think that there's something wrong with that. And the reality is what they're able to do is have an awesome respect for the mystery of God and learn in the process. When it comes to how we exist as sexual beings, how we relate to one another in the sacrament of marriage is a big mystery yet, and we still have a lot yet to learn. May we learn to dismiss some of our fears, lower our anxiety every time we come across an election year that drags in our value statements into things that are perhaps not supposed to be political. It gets us all keyed up. May we learn a way of relaxing to be more childlike and open to the will and mystery of God.